This Sunday, our lesson is from session 10. The passage is Genesis chapter 37, verses 5 through 11, and 19 through 27. The title is Accepted. The way I started the lesson with my class is I had this written on the board. It is impossible to live in this world and not be hurt by someone else's sin. It's impossible to live in this world and not be hurt by someone else's sin. And I asked them if they agreed with that, and they did. And I said, well, if you agree with that, tell me your thoughts about that. And then I asked them as a follow-up question, does that create any theological problems for you about your beliefs in God? We talked about that. Another way that you might consider starting the lesson is to have different parts of a cake mix. And in doing that, you would ask them about how each of those tasted, and they all taste poorly. But when you mix those things together, you have something that you want to go back for seconds. And this lesson has something of that kind of idea about it. Another possibility that you could start your lesson with is talking about a roller coaster ride. How is a roller coaster ride like life? Well, there are ups and there are downs. There are times when it goes kind of slow, and there are other times it speeds by. There are times when you're going one direction and suddenly life takes you in a different direction. Sometimes you're upright, and sometimes you're hanging upside down. Sometimes you're laughing and enjoying it, and sometimes you're scared to death. But the bottom line is you come back safely. How is that like life? From there, I moved into some statements about this lesson. This story that we're reading is not about the tragedy and the problem of playing favorites in a family. There's lessons to learn from that, but that's not what this story is there for. The story is not about the unjust suffering of an innocent person, but there's things to be seen by that. The reason Moses included this story is of what it teaches us about God, and that is that God is sovereign. He is a providential God. You never accept that by being told. You come to accept that by being shown and experience that God takes the evil intentions of people and He can turn those effects of those intentions into His good purposes. And that's why this whole family has to go through this experience in terms of Jacob's family. Now, there's never a miracle that God performs like in the life of Joseph, like He does in the life of Moses. But everywhere in this story, you know God is involved. And that's the way it is with life. We may not have miracles performed, but we know God is involved. The summary statement of the lesson says, God can overcome people's evil intentions, turning the effects of those intentions for His good purposes. And look at that statement again. God can overcome. The point is not you can overcome. It's not that man can overcome, because man doesn't have the strength of will in order to overcome. And some things are bigger than man, but it's God who can overcome. Notice He overcomes. He doesn't neutralize. He doesn't minimize. He doesn't rationalize. He gains the victory over people's evil intentions. And it's evil intentions. Intentions, that is, they're deliberate. They are determined. They are resolved to do you evil. God can take that situation and He can bring victory out of it, turning the effects, that is, the results of people's evil intentions. And sometimes those results are horrible. But God is so great, God is so good, that He can turn the effects of those intentions for His good purposes. Now, God's the greatest good in the universe. God's the greatest being in the universe. And God is so great, He's so loving, He's so powerful, that He can take the evil intentions of people and the results that it has upon our life, and He can turn it to His good purposes. Not necessarily what we might think as good purposes, but His good purposes. And that means it's not only going to be good for me, it's going to be good for you. And not only is it going to be good for me and you, it's going to be good even for the people who had these evil intentions. That's how great, that's how good God is. This is a magnificent philosophy of life. Now, this summary statement doesn't fit the text. If all you had was the text we're going to read in a moment, you would never come to that conclusion. The only reason you come to this conclusion is because you know the rest of the story. And so when you know the rest of the story, you can accept it. But that's the way it is with life. These evil things come into our lives. We cannot see the end of it. We don't understand clearly how God's going to turn this to His good purposes. But we have this conviction. God can overcome people's evil intentions, turning the effects of those intentions for His good purposes, and we accept it. Now, you'll notice in this passage, this lesson, that all the points of the lesson are question marks. Have you ever asked a question and you meant to make a statement? An example was like that. Or maybe someone says, "Are you going to wear that?" They're not asking you a question. They're making a statement. And so this first point, the question is, rule over us? It's really making a statement. Joseph's brothers are saying, you are not going to rule over us. In verse 5 of Genesis chapter 37, it says, Then Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. The room temperature dropped. He said to them, Listen to this dream I had. There we were binding sheaves of grain in the field. And suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you really going to reign over us? His brothers asked him. Are you really going to rule us? So they hated him even more because of his dream. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. Look, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He told his father and brothers, and his father rebuked him. What kind of dream is this that you have had? He said. Am I your mother and your brothers? Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now you will notice in this passage that it's two dreams. And in all the Joseph story, there will always be two dreams. When he's in prison, there's the dream of the cupbearer, there's the dream of the baker. When he goes before Pharaoh, Pharaoh has two dreams that he interprets. Moses later will write, if you want to verify the truthfulness of something, there needs to be two witnesses. Now we know that this is from God. And so what they're really rejecting is not Joseph. Who they're ultimately rejecting is the Lord. Wouldn't it be interesting to know what would have been their response had they loved Joseph, had they admired Joseph, recognized that in him there's a quality of greatness that is going to bring a blessing to this family? I wonder how different their response would have been. That might have been an interesting question to ask. But their response was because they hated Joseph. They were jealous of Joseph. You know, there's some sins we think are small sins. They're not on the same category as adultery and murder and stealing, those kinds of things. And so we don't see the impact of those sins as being as great. But I wonder, do you know of any marriages that have been destroyed because of jealousy? I know of people who've been members of the church, couples, and their they left the church because one of the marriage partners became jealous of the other marriage partner. Maybe one of them had just unusual gifts and abilities, and they was recognized and utilized, and the other person wasn't utilized so much, and there was a jealousy that grew up in that matter. Jealousy has terrible consequences. Some of you have probably had that experience. Maybe it was at work, or maybe it's in your family, and jealousy can have destructive impact. Why is this so destructive? What was it that their rejection of God's revelation caused? Well, they rejected God's plan. They rejected the one God sent to save them. They rejected God, this plan, and in doing that, they rejected God. So their relationship with God was harmed. And when we don't deal with small sins, like jealousy and anger and fear and criticism and judgmentalness and gossip, it has a detrimental effect upon our relationship. Let me quickly move on to the second point. What happens to your dreams now? Now, they see Joseph coming, and as he's coming, they make a plot to kill him. And the point is if we kill him, he won't be able to fulfill his dream then, will he? It reminds you of a New Testament story of someone who claimed to be the Messiah. And the leaders said, well, let's kill him and see how well he fulfills that dream. Now, what I did to apply this lesson is I went to the internet and I copied off some pictures of some broken pots and some broken bowls. There's a Japanese pottery art form called kintsugi. My Japanese is not so good, but it's Kintsugi. And you can read about it, and you can read the history of it, but it's a form in which they take broken pottery and they use gold and other materials to mend that pot or that bowl and to put it back together. And they use it to fix the cracks in that piece of pottery. And when they get through, it's actually more beautiful than before. And it's a wonderful piece of jewelry or pottery for someone. And so I give them a picture of that, and I just ask them, if I gave you this pot or I gave you this bowl and you put it in a prominent place, when you walked by it, what kind of life story would that teach you when you looked at it and you thought about it? And then I asked them, do you have a story like that in your own personal life? And I shared one with them from my personal life about the death of my son and how God used that to train EMTs to properly transport little infants. It's an amazing story, really, of God's providence. The last point is a question, says, what do we gain? When you read through the story, they obviously gained 20 pieces of silver. Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. I guess that's inflation. They gain the fact that they're rid of Joseph now. They gain that possibly now their father will love them. But what they really gain, and they don't know this at this time, but what they've really gained is a Savior who's going to spare their life one day when the famine comes. Now, the way I close the lesson is I tell them a story by Max Lucado, and I give them a card that I've written out this statement on, and I'll include it in the email to you. But the story is Max goes into a grocery store. He meets a church member there, a lady. He says, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. And she begins to tell her story about what's happened. Her husband has traded her in for a younger model. And that has all this ripple effect of damage in her family. And she cries, and he listens and comforts her there in the produce aisle of the grocery store. He has prayer with her. And then he makes this statement to her. This is the statement I've written on a card for each of them. He says, you'll get through this. It won't be painless. It won't be quick. But God will use this mess for good. In the meantime, don't be foolish or naive. Don't despair either. With God's help, you'll get through this. And I simply asked them if they would take the card and put it with the picture of the broken pot. Either put it in their Bible where they'll see it each day, or put it on the refrigerator, and each day just simply look at that picture of something that was broken and is now beautiful, and read that statement. And be reminded, God can overcome people's evil intentions, turning the effects of those intentions for God's good purposes. That is a way to live.